Hello, I'm Ads, and today I'm going to show you how I painted my Sautekh Necron Overlord. I'm starting today with the Overlord glued to a pin. This particular Overlord is a fancy base, so to save me risking the paint job on there, I'll be sorting the silvers first, before gluing him to the base. The back piece and cape is also separate, just to help with painting. I'll be applying the same steps to the back parts too, I just won't be filming those. To start painting, I go from a base coat of lead Belcher spray primer, and I'm adding an all over layer of Null Noil, as is tradition. The Null Noil layer not only darkens down the recesses on the Mini, but also gives my other paint something better to stick to than the very slick spray primer. I'll then relayer over all the silver areas with Ironbreaker. I want the Overlord to look shiny and better maintained than the other Necrons in the army, so a brighter all over relayering will give that impression. In some places where I want a more gradual gradient, I'll water this down to more to a glaze consistency and drag that paint from the dark areas to the lighter ones. With that dry, I take Stormhost Silver and edge highlight all the silver areas. This might take a while, but that solid bright silver edge to all the panels will really punch the divisions between the silver areas. I'll again glaze with this colour, this time towards upper facing areas that would catch the light the most. Lastly on the silvers, I take Basilicanum Grey, water this down and apply to the opposite sides of wherever I did the Stormhost Silver glazes. This forces a gradient to these areas and makes them look much shinier than they actually are, pushing towards an almost chrome-like look. Now attached to the base, I make him look as fancy as he thinks he is by blocking in the gold areas. I use Retributor armour and apply a couple coats to any areas that I want to be gold. In this case, the collar, the centre of the head crest, the loincloth, parts of the scythe, and also the large structure that sits on his back that I've kept separate for now. I want a very rich, warm gold, so I wash the gold areas with Reikland Fleshshade first. This reddish wash really warms the gold through. I'll then embellish the shadows with watered down Wildwood contrast paint. This colour is very, very strong, so I really water this down a lot. I'm just looking to stain any recesses with brown to deepen them, and I prefer to start thin and build up for that. To bring the shine back, I take Auric Armour Gold, thin it down, then look to make gradients towards the upper areas of the gold sections. Auric Armour Gold is something of a difficult colour to use because of its awful coverage, but thinning it down a bit and building up a few layers will give your gold a real warm tone. At this stage, if I feel like I've lost some of the red shading from relayering, I'll bring back the Reikland Fleshshade and glaze a shadow back in. Lastly on the gold, I take an approximately 60-40 mix of Liberator Gold and Stormhost Silver and add an edge highlight. I'm not personally a fan of using the straight Stormhost Silver highlights over gold, so brightening up a paler gold colour like this suits me. If you wanted to do a point highlight with Stormhost after this, it'd look like a better gradient than the straight jump from gold to silver. I worked on the dark green sections next, not the fun glowy greens, I'll do those last. The shoulder pads and cartouche get a base coat of matte black to start with. The greens are brought in with highlights rather than starting with them for a really dark look. Next I use Caliban Green as a glaze towards the edges of the shoulder pads and towards the bottom of the cartouche. This is what fools the eyes into thinking it's seeing green, just a light pass with a glaze or two builds up enough for the effect. These parts are then edge highlighted with Warpstone Glow. I take my time here, I want a consistent line all around the shoulders and on the corners of the cartouche. I also block in the symbol on the cartouche at this point, one or two layers will get a solid green on there. Next, a selective highlight of Moot Green is put on towards the corners and highest points of the shoulder pads and as points on the bottom corners of the cartouche. I also painted just the arms of the cartouche symbol, basically everything except the ring in the centre. As a last step, I take Eero Yellow and just touch the brush to the ends of the symbol of the cartouche, makes it pop a little more off the darker background. My Overlords have gold, white and silver headdresses where I can, so I'm going to paint the winged sections on either side of this one's white to match that. I start with a base coat of Celestra Grey, being really careful about where the brush goes. I don't want to spoil the gold or the silver that I've finished already. I also decided to do the outer band of the shoulder pads in white just for some variation. Next on the white, I take some thin Ulthuan Grey and start to carefully relayer. To get a nice smooth white, I need this to be thin, almost glaze-like where it's needed to get the gradient I'm looking for. Take your time and build the paint up slowly, it'll be worth it. I give that a wash of thinned down Gryph-Charger Grey contrast paint, about half paint to half water. For the headdress, I push it up around the edges of the white sections and along the crease where it flares out. And for the shoulders, I glazed away from the highest top part of the white. I use this quite thin so I can control how strong the shade gets. In some areas another layer or two will help build in a nicer bluey shadow. Lastly, I edge highlight these parts with white ink to finish them off for now, bar the orbs and such. Again, the ink's thinned a bit to help make a smooth white colour and glazed on the most exposed sections for a bright spot. Couple colours left before the shiny greens, starting with these cables. If you've seen my prior Necron Warrior tutorial, I use the same colours here as I do with those, but to summarise, I start by blocking in the ribbed cables with Corax White, before washing all over them with Gryph-Charger Grey, then Black Templar. The Gryph-Charger pre-shade tints the highlights towards a bluer tone before the black makes the rest, well, black. These are then highlighted with Thunderhawk Blue, and then Fenrisian Grey, and a final dot of Ulthuan Grey for sheen. The texture on this particular model is not well pronounced on these cables, so you can see I gave up trying to just paint the ridges and tried introducing Black Templar to the recesses later on. This didn't work, but it was worth a try. I had to repaint the highlights in afterwards to bring them back up a bit. I'm not 100% happy with them, but it's not a major focus on the mini, so I just moved on. The smooth cables are much easier. These are based with Demonet Hide first, before being washed with Nuln Oil. I try and push the wash towards the extreme ends of the cable to make the middle parts look a bit brighter. These cables are then relayered with Demonet Hide, highlighted with Warp Fiend Grey, and a final highlight of Slaanesh Grey. There's a couple robot equivalents of tassels hanging around his head and the metal loincloth, so I'm just picking these out next. I want these to resemble Blackstone, so I start by basing them with Incubi Darkness. I also based the flat gems on the loincloth with this. A quick wash of Nuln Oil darkens these areas down, then an edge highlight to each segment with Calibite Green brings them back up, taking my time to try not to drop any into the recesses. If you do, bring back Incubi Darkness and just touch those up. I also ran an edge around the gems to highlight those up, followed by a glaze towards the top half or so, wanting these to look shiny. Lastly, I put on some point highlights of Cyberite Green to each corner of the tassel segments, another edge highlight around the bottom of the gems, just smaller than the Cabalite highlight, and another smaller glaze to the top parts. The gems are finished off with a dot of white ink at the very top after that. A big detail I've not touched on yet is the big segmented cape the Overlord wears. The price of painting in sub-assemblies, I forgot he had one. I base all the segments on the cape in a couple layers of Runelord brass first. Note that I did the inside of the cape separate and then stuck it to the model. I kept dropping it and was worried I'd break it. The cape is then given a good wash of Agrax Earthshade. I'm looking for good separation between each plate with this wash. I then dry brush the plates with Runelord brass again to bring back some of the original tone. Another dry brush next, this time with Sautekh Alloy. I go a bit lighter this time. You don't want to get rid of all the Runelord brass. Focus around the corners rather than the face of the plates. I brought back the Agrax Earthshade at this point, watered down a bit, and glazed the bottom section to the larger plates to add more to the depth of the metallic. This is optional, I just like the look of it. It adds a bit more contrast. There are a bunch of orbs on the cape, which if you'd like you can leave metallic. I opted to paint the smaller ones in the same way as the Blackstone orbs on the loincloth here, leaving the larger ones for when I do the lighter greens in a minute. Your call though, it's a lot more work doing this. I'll hit the Scythe up next as there's only a couple of colours to worry about before we start on the glazing sections. Firstly the handle. I base coat it with Corvus Black, being super careful around the gold sections and the hand holding the scythe. Then I roughly highlighted each segment of the handle with Eshin Grey. Hit both the top and bottom of the segments here. Eshin Grey isn't much of a jump in colour from Corvus Black, but it'll help define the handle better. I then highlighted the top parts again, this time with Dawnstone, and to help much better define the handle and clean up my mistakes whilst I'm at it, I watered down some matte black and painted it into the grooves between the segments. The smoother parts of the handle I paint dark blue with lightning strikes in them. I base these sections with dark Reaper, being careful around the gold. These then get a couple washes of Nuln Oil, first all over, then just towards the lower half or so of each tube. Then the tricky part. I take Baharoth blue and freehand some squiggly angled lines to mimic a lightning bolt. Truthfully, I didn't make too good of a job of it on this one. I probably needed to thin my paint more, but it still reads as intended from a distance, and that's what matters. Lastly, I take white ink and selectively highlight the lightning bolts I drew on. Focus on connecting lines and sharp or interesting edges for this. I'd put another line down the whole thing if it were on a larger area, but I wasn't comfortable doing that here. Just the essentials is all that's needed this time. I then cover these tubes with a coat of Ard Coat Gloss Varnish. This is optional, I just personally like adding the gloss shine to these areas to make them read more as glass. Okay, I'm going to do the brighter green sections next, the fun part. And I'll start with my first Necron Energy Blade on the channel. Ooh. I start by blocking in the Scythe blade and the cable by the blade with matte black. Contrast is a big thing with Necron blades, so I start with black to build up from, and the cable's going to follow the same colours, so I'll do it alongside the blade. I then take Caliban green, heavily water it down to a glaze, and pull in a pattern similar to a true metallic metal, or TMM pattern. If you're new to this, with regards to blades, a TMM pattern is an asymmetric way that you can add shading to give it a contrasted look. Typically this involves adding a glazed gradient on one side of the blade, then doing so to the opposite side on the other. For the Scythe blade here, I'm going to do the large main highlight on the upper facing side of the blade, a second one towards the tip, and a smaller one along the angled edge of the blade between these two. If it's all going over your head, hopefully seeing the end result will help. It can be daunting and tricky to wrap your head around at first. Some things to note. I have this part of the gradient either touch or cross over across the opposite side of a blade to help smooth out the blend and give more area to play with. Also super important to remember, do the other side as well. The same is then repeated with Warp Stone Glow, building up in a smaller area this time. How you move the brush is important when trying to get a gradient with the glazing. Pulling the brush from the dark colour to where you want it brightest drags the colour with the brush and deposits more where the brush leaves the mini. So with that in mind, I'm taking the brush off the mini where I want the colour to be the boldest, and with each layer dragging to the same spot. Eventually the colour builds in around that initial coloured spot and you get a nice gradient as you go. The last glazed layer to the blade is with Moot Green. I've struggled glazing with Moot Green in the past, so I tend to dilute this about 1 to 3 with Larmian Medium and then thinning it with water from there. I'm again building up in a smaller area than last time, pulling my brush towards the brightest point. The last part of the blade and cable of the Scythe are the final accent colours. The cable gets a very thin glaze of Aerial Yellow to warm up the green at its hottest point. The Scythe blade, however, is getting a full edge highlight with Gauss Blaster green. I'll not lie, this step is difficult and time consuming. I often make mistakes and have to come back to my previous colours to fix errors. Take your time and go slowly, water down the paint a touch more than you would to let it run smooth, and work your way around the hard edges of the blade. I base any orbs that I want to glow with Warpstone Glow first, including the Resurrection Orb. This will take a couple coats to get solid, and you'll want to thin this a bit more than usual to get it as smooth as possible. I'll also thin this even more to a glaze consistency and run it wholly into the eye sockets and to about 2/3 of the slats in the rib cage. The eyes just need flooding, not much to say there, but for the ribs I pull the paint from the outside to the middle as I want it to look like there's something glowing behind the cartouche. I then bring in the Moot Green again and mix it again with Alarmian Medium 1 to 3 to make the glaze I made for the Scythe blade. This goes in the ribs again, just to a smaller area, as well as bringing the brighter green into the centre of the orbs. I'll take this to areas that would catch the glow around the orbs too, like around the hand and forearm where the Resurrection Orb is going nuts. A more usual layering consistency is then used to block in the eyeballs, you can't forget those. Now we're getting to the brightest colours for the last couple steps. I use Gauss Blaster Green to dot his eyes first, taking my time just touching the brush to his eyes, then to edge highlight around his hand or the green glazing from earlier. This is then thinned to the same 3:1 Alarmian Medium mix as the Moot Green, and applied to a small area of the Resurrection Orb. I'm trying to make it look like it's being used here, so going for a white hot glow. At this point everything bar the last mix on the Res Orb is done. So I take the time now to go over any orbs that I want to glow under blacklight with a thin coat or two of Vallejo green fluor. The rest of my army has these fluorescent accents to them, and the cabinet I keep them in has a black light, so I want some of these orbs to pop under that. And finally, I mix the Gauss Blaster Green 50/50 with white ink, and firstly make a last pointed highlight to the areas closest to the orb, then getting it to a glaze consistency and putting the final touch to the orb itself. I'll not lie, I'm not super thrilled with the orb here. I was trying to paint it the same way as the glowing warriors on the base and forgot how I did it. Note down your recipes, folks. It'll be savable by upping the brightness way up, but for now I'll leave it as it is and come back another time. It reads, it's just not perfect. And with the base rim touched up, the Overlord is complete. Generally, I'm really happy with how mine turned out here. The base really makes him stand out, and I think with a bit more work, the orb resurrecting the warriors will look fantastic. I'll likely use a lot of the same scheme for my lords when I get around to those. I've got 1 or 2 to paint yet, and it'll work great for them too. If you have any questions, or if I skipped over something too quickly, leave a comment below and I'll get back to you. Thanks again for watching, good luck with your own Overlords, and I'll see you again soon.